Before the temples reached for the heavens, before the gods were carved into stone, there was war. And behind that war stood one man, Suryavarman II. He did not inherit his throne. He seized it. In a kingdom riven by civil conflict, he carved his name into history, not through peace but through bloodshed. His rise was no coronation, it was conquest. Brother killed brother, provinces burned, and in the ashes Suryavarman crowned himself not just king but god. He built Angkor Wat, not as a sanctuary, but as a statement of domination, etched in stone and sweat. But it was the battlefield, not the temple, where his true legacy began. From the embattled lands of Viet to the coastal jungles of Champa, his armies marched under banners of divine war. His generals were not merely soldiers, they were instruments of cosmic will. Every arrow loosed, every enemy slain, was done in the name of order, of empire, of Suryavarman himself. But power has a cost, and while kings rise on conquest, it is the people, farmers, mothers, monks, who pay in silence. This is not the tale of a builder. This is the tale of the blade behind the stone. Part 1. The Warrior King. Conquests, sieges, and the rise of divine rule. Before Angkor Wat reached into the heavens, its first stones were laid in blood. The 12th century in Cambodia was no time for peace. It was an age of smoke and fractured thrones. And from that chaos rose one man, cloaked in both ambition and war. Suryavarman II was not born to rule, he took it by force. His claim to the Khmer throne came not through sacred lineage, but through the blade. As a young prince, he watched his kingdom split between rival kings, each grasping for power like starving wolves. But while others negotiated and prayed, he prepared. When his time came, he struck. He gathered armies from the northeast, from the forgotten provinces and borderland tribes, those tired of weak kings and divided rule. His forces marched like a storm through the heart of Angkor. The reigning monarch fell thrown from his divine seat, not by fate, but by steel. And in his place stood Suryavarman, the new god king. But conquest within was only the beginning. Suryavarman did not see his empire as enough. He believed the Khmer were destined to rule not only their land, but all that surrounded it. Where his ancestors had built temples, he would build an army. Where they offered peace to neighbors, he would deliver war. His gaze turned outward. To the east, the kingdom of Champa stood in defiance, wealthy, coastal, proud. A long-time rival, Champa was both prize and obstacle. To control its trade routes meant controlling the arteries of the South China Sea. And so, Suryavarman unleashed his military machine. Fleets were carved from dense jungle hardwoods. War elephants were trained and armored. Supply lines stretched across river and dirt. He rallied tens of thousands under his banner, not simply to fight but to conquer for the divine order he now embodied. The invasion was brutal. The Khmer came like thunder. Villages along the borders vanished beneath the weight of marching armies. Temples were repurposed into barracks. Fields were trampled beneath iron and hoof. The Champa resisted ferociously, but the tide of the Khmer Empire seemed endless. Cities fell, one after another, their names stripped from maps, their leaders hung or paraded in shame. But conquest in Champa was not just about war, it was about domination of spirit. Suryavarman sent messages not of alliance, but of submission, join or burn. The Kham kings resisted longer than expected, their guerrilla tactics slowing the Khmer advance. But every delay came with a cost. Villages turned to ash, temples shattered, rivers filled with bodies. And while the Eastern War raged, Suryavarman's ambitions stretched further still. To the north, Viet rose as a formidable power. Though more distant, their influence could not be ignored. Suryavarman sent envoys, not to negotiate, but to demand recognition. The Vietnamese refused. It was a fatal insult. While the Eastern War drained Khmer strength, Suryavarman ordered campaigns into Viet territory, showing no fear, no hesitation. These were not easy victories. The terrain was hostile, the resistance fierce, but the message was clear. The Khmer Empire would not retreat. In the heart of Angkor, Suryavarman constructed not just temples, but symbols of supremacy. Angkor Wat, often remembered for its beauty, was first and foremost a political weapon. It was designed to dwarf all things. Its towers were not prayers, but declarations. Its berry leaves did not show peace, they showed war. Rows upon rows of soldiers, marching in perfect discipline. Gods granting victory to the Khmer, kings triumphant over enemies. Every stone was propaganda, carved for eternity. But war cannot feed itself forever. With every campaign, the strain grew. Men were drafted from farms, leaving wives and children to struggle alone. Crops failed under neglect. Roads cracked under the weight of endless logistics. In the cities, the cost of war began to surface: shortages, inflation, unrest. Priests insisted that the king still held divine favor, but whispers passed among the people. Why, they asked, did a god need so much grain? Why did victory taste like ash? Suryavarman pressed onward. He was not a king who ruled from a throne. He ruled from horseback, from elephant back, from the battlefield. He led personally, often clad in gold-edged armor, his presence both inspiring and terrifying. His generals feared disappointing him more than death itself. His laws were strict. Discipline in the army was absolute. Deserters were executed without trial. Retreat was not an option. His soldiers were more than warriors, they were instruments of will, forged by a king who saw empire not as land, but as destiny. But empires built on constant expansion eventually find no room left to grow. The Champa campaigns began to falter. Supply lines stretched too thin. Monsoons washed away bridges. Disease crept into the camps. Fevers, infected wounds, dysentery. Viet raids disrupted Khmer border towns. Revolts broke out in the outer provinces, crushed quickly but with growing frequency. And through it all, the king kept building temples, roads, military outposts. It was as though he believed that if he could shape enough stone, he could hold back time itself. But time does not obey kings. As Suryavarman aged, his campaigns slowed, not from lack of will, but from the breaking of bodies and spirits beneath him. He had become a figure both feared and mythologized. Some called him divine, others whispered that he was cursed. No one knew the full number of lives lost during his reign, but they knew the silence that followed his name. He died without clear successor. His empire stretched wide, but it was tired. The armies that had once thundered across Asia now limped home, broken. Angkor Wat stood, but the cost of its glory echoed through empty villages and hollow fields. His death did not bring collapse, not yet, but the seeds had been planted. Without Suryavarman, the Khmer Empire would struggle to find direction. His successors lacked his will, his brutality, his vision, and the enemies he had held at bay would return stronger, emboldened, and more patient. Still, his shadow lingered. Even centuries later, soldiers and kings spoke his name with both awe and dread. He was the king who turned temples into weapons, who saw diplomacy as weakness, who ruled not by bloodline but by conquest. His military legacy was not just in the borders he expanded, but in the fear he inspired and the iron discipline he demanded. But for the farmers who buried sons they would never see again, for the builders whose hands bled to carve gods into stone, for the mothers who lit incense before silent shrines, his legacy was more complicated. For them, he was not just a warrior king, he was the price of power made flesh. Part 2. Steel and Spirit. Everyday survival in the shadow of war. The drums of empire did not only echo across battlefields, they beat through the rice fields, the temple courtyards, the village paths overgrown with roots and prayer. Under the reign of Suryavarman II, life for the common Khmer was no less shaped by war than that of the soldiers who marched to die beneath foreign suns. In the countryside, the king's image loomed like a god of law and storm. His face, carved into the towers of temples, watched every field. His name was carried by tax collectors and generals. His voice echoed through stone proclamations demanding grain, labor, and loyalty. Even in the quietest corners of the empire, his wars reached like fingers demanding sacrifice. The draft came without warning. Able-bodied men were seized from farms, conscripted into armies they did not understand to fight in places they would never return from. Sons disappeared at dawn. Fathers left behind scythes for spears. Women were left to tend to the rice, rebuild homes, bury the old and raise the young. What had once been a village of laughter and incense became a place of whispers and waiting. For the soldiers, the march was not glorious. There were no golden chariots, no cheering crowds, just blistered feet and endless mud. The war elephants loomed above them, majestic in ceremony but terrifying in motion. Discipline was brutal, food was scarce, disease claimed more than the enemy ever did. When the king marched, it was said that the heavens opened for him. But for those below, the heavens wept blood and sickness. Rations were nothing more than cold rice, dried fish, or, when supply lines failed, boiled roots dug from riverbanks. Sleep was snatched between raids. Punishment for retreat or disobedience was immediate binding, beating or death. Still, they obeyed, not from loyalty, but from fear, from desperation, from the knowing that no one returned home unchanged. And at home, life was no gentler. The temples, while rising in impossible grandeur, fed not the people but the gods, or rather, the king's image of them. Artisans were pulled from families to labor day and night. Stone by stone, they built Angkor Wat, hauling sandstone from quarries miles away, carving every corner with stories they would never read. Fingers bled, backs broke. For many, death came not from war, but from the very creation of what would become history's greatest monument. And yet they worked, because to serve the king was to serve the divine, or so they were told, because refusal meant execution, because hunger in the fields was worse than the lash in the stoneyard. Even religion bowed beneath Suryavarman's sword. The king, though Hindu by faith, reshaped the spiritual landscape. Temples were rededicated. Gods became instruments of power. Vishnu, whom he worshipped most, was no longer simply a protector, he was an extension of the king's authority. Suryavarman was the earthly embodiment of cosmic order, and to defy him was to defy the heavens themselves. Priests who questioned this balance were silenced. Rituals became politicized. Prayer became theater. Faith, once a matter of the soul, became a matter of loyalty. But beneath the grandeur, the pageantry, the chants and bells, the people still endured in quieter ways. In the shadow of Angkor Wat, children played between half-built colonnades, too young to understand the cost of the stone around them. Farmers made offerings to old spirits, not the gods of the temples, but the ones their grandparents had known. Spirits of tree and river, of soil and smoke. Mothers whispered lullabies that spoke of peace, of a world before the wars. Old men carved amulets from bone, charms not for battle, but for survival. And food, simple, humble food, became a ritual in itself. When rice grew thin, villagers turned to jungle greens. 2 snails plucked from muddy pools, 2 frogs roasted over embers, bamboo shoots, wild mushrooms, bitter roots crushed with salt. Every meal was a negotiation with nature, a promise that they would not be swallowed by the empire's hunger. Families sat together beneath thatched roofs, sharing silence more than stories, watching the horizon for the return of sons who would never arrive. Trade suffered under the strain of constant war. Caravans that once brought spice, silk and bronze now carried weapons, soldiers, and the wounded. Markets shrank, coin lost value, barter returned, a basket of rice for 2 clay jars, a woven mat for a handful of salt, and always the question, how long could this go on? Still, not all stories were sorrow. In hidden monasteries, monks preserved ancient texts, copying them by candlelight, away from the king's gaze. They taught children to read, not the language of war, but of poetry and philosophy. Some spoke in hushed tones of the Mahabharata, of kings who fell from grace, of empires swallowed by their own ambition. Others told tales of balance, of dharma, of peace earned not through conquest but through restraint. In the mountain villages, where Khmer influence thinned, old traditions persisted. Dances for forgotten gods, healing rituals with herbs and chants, ceremonies at moonrise, not to honor kings, but to remember ancestors. There, the empire was a rumor, a distant echo. Life remained hard, but it remained theirs. And then came the end. Suryavarman II died far from battle, without glory, without spectacle. His body was never recovered, his bones lost to the soil. His death sent tremors through the court. Without his iron grip, the gears of empire stuttered. The military campaigns ceased. The borders wavered, rebellions flickered, then spread. Those who had suffered in silence found new voices. Some temples were abandoned mid-construction. Orders were forgotten. Statues were left half-carved, prayers half-finished. But he had already reshaped the world. His wars, his laws, his vision, they carved paths that could not be erased. Angkor Wat, the temple built to crown his reign, remained a monument not just to divinity, but to ambition, to sacrifice, to cost, and to the people who lived through it. What remained was not glory, it was memory, etched not in stone, but in scars, in lullabies, in silence, in the way a mother's eyes searched the road at dusk, in the way a monk paused between verses, in the way the wind moved through abandoned fields. For them, history was not about kings, it was about surviving them. Suryavarman II left behind no dynasty, no heirs fit to carry his weight, but his military legacy endured in the very bones of the Khmer Empire. The discipline, the expansion, the fear, it built greatness, and it broke it, because behind every empire is a village emptied, a song silenced, a hand clenched around hope, not sword, and in the end, even the greatest warrior king becomes memory. Until next time, stay safe, and see you in the next history.